Hey everyone, and welcome. Today, we're digging into a really interesting argument about the American economy. We're going to look at how the relationship between government programs and, our day-to-day costs has changed over the years, all based on our source material. So let's just jump right in. A house, two cars, all on a single salary. You've probably heard this before, right? It's this simple phrase that really captures what our source calls the classic American dream. It paints this picture of a comfortable, middle-class life that the text argues used to be totally within reach for a lot of families with just one person working. So where did that dream even come from? Well, according to our source, this kind of prosperity was built on a very specific economic foundation, free market capitalism, and really the power of individual initiative. The idea here is that these principles, a free market with the government mostly staying out of the way, created these really strong incentives for people to work hard and innovate. And that, in turn, generated an incredibly high standard of living. But the argument goes, there's been a major policy shift since then, and that's where the story really starts to change. So how exactly did things change? Well, this is where the source explores how government interventions, even with the best intentions, can sometimes lead to some pretty serious unintended consequences. Specifically, the rising cost of things we all need. And this brings us to a really interesting concept that the source uses to explain what's happened with higher education costs. It's called the Bennett hypothesis. And the theory is pretty simple. When the government makes it easier to get financial aid, colleges don't actually lower their prices. Instead, they raise tuition because they know students can just borrow more money to pay for it. And wow, this chart really drives that point home. I mean, look at that. According to the data presented in our source, the price of college tuition has just skyrocketed past the general rate of inflation over the last few decades. The argument here is that this is no accident. It's a direct result of policies that made student loans so widely available. And we see a really similar pattern when it comes to housing. The source connects these soaring home prices to things like easy mortgages and rental vouchers. Now, these policies were designed to help people, of course, but the side effect is that they flood the market with more buyers and renters, which can push prices up for everybody. It's that classic supply and demand problem. And you guessed it, the trend pops up again in healthcare. The source argues that government subsidies and insurance mandates also end up boosting the demand for medical services, but without really increasing the supply of doctors or hospitals to match. And the result is what you see here, another steep rise in costs. It's the same pattern we saw in education and housing. But the argument isn't just about rising prices. The source points to two other huge challenges it connects to these large-scale government programs. First, how vulnerable they are to fraud, and second, the wider social impact of creating dependency. Let's take a look at that first one. Okay, just look at this number. $250 million. That's not the total cost of fraud. That's the estimated loss from just a single case. The source uses the Feeding Our Future scheme in Minnesota as an example, where federal funds that were supposed to feed hungry kids during the pandemic were allegedly stolen on an absolutely massive scale. So how does something like that even happen? Well, this timeline kind of breaks it down. The source explains that the rules were loosened, for good reasons, to get help out faster. But that created this huge opportunity, and it was exploited almost immediately, siphoning away hundreds of millions of dollars from the people who actually needed it. It's a really sobering example of good intentions gone wrong. Now, to really drive this point home, the source uses a pretty powerful and, I should say, stark analogy. It compares society to a living body. A healthy, contributing citizen is like a healthy cell. It helps the whole body function. On the other hand, it likens long-term dependency without any contribution to a cancerous cell, one that just drains resources and weakens the entire system. It's a dramatic comparison for sure, but it gets to the core of the argument being made. And there's another analogy, this one from nature. Think about a balanced ecosystem. Everything has a role, right? Predators keep populations in check. Plants create oxygen. The source argues that human societies are kind of the same. They thrive when people are incentivized to contribute. And if you take away that incentive, it suggests, you can throw the whole system out of whack, just like in nature. All right, so after laying out all these challenges, cost, fraud, dependency, what's the proposed path forward? Well, the focus now shifts to how we might rebalance policy to promote sustainability and opportunity in the long run. Let's see what they suggest. So the text lays out this multi-step approach. First, make sure aid is targeted and comes with strong incentives to work. Second, get really aggressive about preventing fraud. Third, push for free market reforms that could actually lower the costs of housing, education, and healthcare. And finally, work on fostering a culture that really values ambition and contribution. It's a big plan, for sure. But ultimately, the source doesn't end on a negative note. It's actually quite hopeful. The suggestion is that these huge economic challenges aren't impossible to solve, but it's going to require a really thoughtful, deliberate shift in our policy choices to make sure that dream is still there for the next generation. It's basically a call to action. And that really leaves us with the central question at the heart of this whole analysis. When we look at this complex dance between aid, incentives, and the economy, the challenge is always going to be, how do you design a system that's compassionate for people who are in need, but is also economically sustainable for everyone in the long run? It's a tough one to think about. What do you think?